Antes que nada, quiero agradecer a todos los que hicieron el episodio de hoy posible. En especial a Eduardo Crócamo, que sin él no hubiera podido conseguir el contacto del invitado del día de hoy. Creo que el episodio del día de hoy les va a gustar bastante, en especial por quien nos va a contar una historia a través de palabras. Tristemente no pudimos tenerlo en cámara ni en videollamada por temas de arreglos y privacidad. Pero igualmente tuve el chance de preguntarle 6 de las preguntas más personales que él ha tenido en su vida. Y bueno, espero que les guste el episodio del día de hoy. ...1989 Panama City. A 9-year-old boy is brought to meet the president of the Dominican Republic. Not for a school trip, not for a photo, to negotiate. His father, son of the most feared dictator in Dominican history, needed permission to return to his country. And the only way to get it was to send his son to ask him in person. That boy is Francisco Trujillo, Rafael Trujillo's grandson. I sent him 6 questions. He answered all of them. What he said stopped me. Welcome to Boring History, where history is anything but.
What, if any, mistakes do you think that your father made when he headed the government?
Creo que como todos los humanos, cometió algunos errores, pero no tan grande como algunos errores que ha cometido el gobierno de los Estados Unidos en los últimos años.
Rafael Leonidas Trujillo Molina was born in 1891 in San Cristobal, Dominican Republic. He was lower middle class. His maternal grandmother was Haitian. I want you to hold on to that. He rose to the military, trained in part by US Marines during the American occupation. By 1930, he was the most powerful military figure in the country. He ran for president in an election where his opponents were beaten into silence. He won with 95% of the votes. He renamed the capital city, Santo Domingo, founded in 1496, one of the oldest cities in the Americas, after himself, Ciudad Trujillo. He also renamed the tallest mountain after himself. He required every Dominican household to hang his portrait on the wall, with a sign that read, "In this house, Trujillo is the chief." He powdered his face to appear lighter skinned. He was part Haitian in a country where he had built an entire national identity around anti-Haitian racism. That contradiction, hating in others while you carry in yourself, is the key to understanding October 1937. Soldiers stopped people at the borders. They hold up a sprig of parsley. They asked, "What is that?" If you can roll the R in perejil, the Spanish word, you go home. If you grew up speaking Haitian Creole and can't roll that R, you die. Between 9,000 and 30,000 people were murdered in just 6 days. His maternal grandmother would have not passed the test. The man who ordered the massacre would have not survived himself. But here's a part of the story that nobody knows. 1938, Evian, France, representatives from 32 countries met to discuss what to do about Jewish refugees fleeing Nazi Germany. 31 countries said no. Too many refugees. Not our problem, doors closed. One country raises its hand and says, "We'll take them, up to 100,000. That country was Dominican Republic. Hundreds of Jewish families were settled in a town on the northern coast called Sosúa. They built a cooperative. They built a community. The same man who ordered the Parsley massacre, who killed tens of thousands of Haitians, to prove a racial theory built on a lie about his own heritage. This same man opened his doors to Jewish families that every other nation had turned away. Both of those things are true. This is the same man, in the same decade. I've been thinking about that for the past few weeks, and then Francisco told me something that made it even more personal. I asked Francisco when was the first time he understood what his family name was, not just as a family, but as history. I grew up in a house where the last name wasn't announced. It was simply breathed. It was in the military photographs, in the polo trophies, in a father who lived with a soldier's discipline. That was my only normal. So as a child, when school asked what I wanted to be when I grew up, my answer was always the same: general. It wasn't an ambition from history books. It was simply what you lived at home. That year, my grandmother died in Panama. Maria Martinez, the general's widow, first lady for 30 years. That same year, at 9 years old, I made my first trip to the Dominican Republic. For my father to enter the country, some friends took me to ask permission in person from President Balaguer. I was a 9-year-old boy negotiating in front of a head of state for his father's right to come home. Later, when my father had already died and I was studying at a military boarding school, it was my cousin, Ramfis, who gave me my grandfather for real. He didn't talk about the statue in the headlines. He talked about the man who got down on the floor to play with his grandchildren. That's when I understood completely. My grandfather wasn't just a relative. He was history itself. A 9-year-old boy negotiating with a president for his father's right to go home. That is what a legacy does to a family. I asked him what it was like inside the house, whether the name was spoken. This is what he said. Behind closed doors, almost nothing was said. When they killed the general, my father was only 18 years old. What he lost that night wasn't just his father. It was his entire world. In one night, they took his country, his place, his sentences, the very ground he stood on. That kind of collapse never closes. What you breathed at home was that. My father carried the double grief like a quiet weight. You noticed it in his long silence, in how he lowered his voice when the name came out by accident, in those questions you learn not to ask. There was never an explicit prohibition. There was something deeper, the respect you keep for a wound that's still open. From the exiled, one word always returned in a low voice, like a thorn: ingratitude. The certainty that those who owed him most were the first to turn their backs when he fell. The name only appeared when the old friends came to Panama. Then, over the sign of ice in glasses, the conversations would loosen with the night, and I'll watch those men soften when they invoked him, as if they were young again in a country that only existed inside of them. Before I get to Francisco's most personal question, I want to tell you about 4 different women. They were called Las Mariposas, the butterflies: Patria, Dede, Minerva, and Maria Teresa Mirabal. They organized a resistance against Trujillo, smuggled weapons, refused to stop even after Trujillo imprisoned their husbands. November 25, 1960, his secret police stopped their cars in a mountain road. They strangled them, put the bodies back in the car, pushed it off a cliff. Dede survived. She wasn't in the car. She lived until 2014 carrying her sisters. Trujillo thought killing them would end the resistance. 6 months later, his own people shot him on a highway in the capital. He died fighting back. He was 69 years old. The capital city got his name back, Santo Domingo. His statues came down, but his family was still there, carrying his name. I asked Francisco how does he feel about his grandfather, knowing he had no choice. This is what he wrote. You don't choose a grandfather, and that's clear to me. But you learn early that the last name enters a room before you do, with all his prejudices, and you grow up constantly proving that you're not it. I never knew him. The man I know was assembled from pieces of everyone's memory. Someone capable of tenderness in private that the world never saw. It took me years to hold both faces at once. I know the world knows the general. I'm not here to replace one version with another. I'm here to say that mine also exists. My task isn't to carry him as a sentence or to live in his shadow. It's to understand what of that history formed me so I can decide what I do with it. I asked if there's anything that the world has completely misunderstood. He quoted a writer, Antonio Gala. History is not, by any stretch, the account that it is made of it. Each person tells what they saw or what they imagine they saw. If another told it, they'll do it differently. And then he told me about Sosua. In 1938, when 31 countries closed their doors to Jewish fleeing Hitler, the Dominican Republic said yes. My grandfather offered to receive up to 100,000. Hundreds of families arrived, built a cooperative, built a community. Children of those families are alive today because of that decision. And here's what makes it personal for me. My own mother descends from the Sephardic Jewish community of Jamaica. My great-grandfather led the Jewish congregation in Kingston. By the inscrutable turns that life takes, the refuge my grandfather opened ended up crossing generations later with a community that would become part of his own descendants' history. I lived it in the strangest way. A Holocaust survivor came to speak at my military school. When I approached him afterwards and told him who I was, his face completely changed. He told me that many of his people had been saved there on that island. He started thanking me over and over with tears in his eyes, as if he had in front of him made person the salvation he had received. I carried the last name that almost everywhere opened doors with fear. That man, for one moment, gave it back to me as something else. Wow. The man who ordered the massacre of around 30,000 people also saved hundreds of Jewish families. And his grandson carries both sides of that history in his blood. I don't know what to do with that. I don't think Francisco does either. Maybe that's the point. I asked Francisco one last question. What do you want the name Trujillo to mean when people talked about you? He said, I want the name for once to open a door not with prejudice, but with curiosity and respect. I don't renounce where I come from. I carry my complete history with my head held high, without asking forgiveness for having been born where I was born, but using it as a root of wisdom, not as a way to be dragged. Wow. If there's anything I want, is that when someone says Trujillo, thinking of me, they don't think of a portrait in black and white, but of a man who honored his blood, who recognized those who truly saw him, and who was never afraid of his own name. That is the history that's mine to write. Amazing. History is written by winners, but the family of the losers, and sometimes the family of the ones who did the losing on purpose, they're still here, still carrying the name, still deciding what to do with it. Francisco didn't choose his grandfather. He chose what to build on top of him. That distinction matters. Rafael Trujillo ruled the Dominican Republic for 21 years. He was one of the most brutal dictators of the 20th century. He was also someone's grandfather, someone who got in the floor to play with his grandchildren. Both of those things are true. History doesn't resolve that. It just hands it to the next generation and says, your turn.